On November 14, 1942, the USS South Dakota was surrounded by Japanese warships in the waters off Guadalcanal. Enemy shells were ripping through the hull. Fires erupted across multiple decks. Sailors were being cut down by shrapnel everywhere. In the chaos, one young gunner was hit in the face by flying metal. The blast threw him down 3 levels of the ship's superstructure. His jaw was shattered. Burns covered his arms, but instead of staying down, he dragged himself back to his battle station and started pulling wounded men to safety. The Navy would later try to erase what happened that night. They stripped this sailor of his medals. They threw him in the brig for 3 months. They discharged him in disgrace, all because of one simple fact they discovered after the battle. This hero was 12 years old. If you want to know how a boy too young for 7th grade fooled the entire United States Navy and fought in one of the deadliest naval battles of the Pacific War, keep watching. By the summer of 1942, America was losing the war in the Pacific. The Japanese had swept through the Philippines, captured Singapore, and were threatening Australia. Every week brought news of another defeat, another island fallen, another ship sunk. Calvin Graham was living in Crockett, Texas, in a home that offered no escape from the chaos. His parents had divorced. His mother was struggling. His older brothers had already enlisted and shipped out. At 12 years old, Calvin was essentially raising himself. He watched the newsreels at the local theater. He saw the footage of burning ships at Pearl Harbor. He heard the radio reports about American boys dying on beaches halfway around the world. And something inside him decided he could not just sit and wait. The Navy was desperate for recruits. Recruiting stations were under pressure to meet quotas. Background checks were minimal. If a young man looked old enough and had the right paperwork, they would take him. Calvin was 5 feet 2 inches tall. He weighed about 125 pounds. He looked young, but not impossibly young. With the right documents, he might just pass. The problem was getting those documents. His mother would never sign the consent form. No legitimate notary would stamp papers for a 12-year-old. If Calvin wanted to join the Navy, he would have to do something that could land him in serious trouble. He would have to become a forger. Calvin's plan was simple and dangerous. He needed his mother's signature on the Navy consent form. He needed a notary stamp to make it official. And he needed to look old enough to pass the physical examination. First, he practiced forging his mother's signature. He studied her handwriting for days, copying every curve and loop until he could reproduce it perfectly. Then he found a way to get a notary stamp. The details of how he obtained it were never fully revealed, but somehow a 12-year-old boy got his hands on an official government seal. Next came the physical transformation. Calvin borrowed clothes from his older cousin. He shaved the peach fuzz from his face to look more mature. He practiced deepening his voice. He memorized a fake birth date that would make him 17 years old. On the day of his enlistment, Calvin walked into the Navy recruiting station in Houston, Texas. His heart was pounding. His forged papers were in his pocket. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The recruiter barely looked at him. The quota pressure was intense. Young men were signing up by the dozens every day. Calvin handed over his documents. The recruiter glanced at the signature, checked the notary stamp, and nodded. Just like that, Calvin Leon Graham became a United States Navy sailor. He was assigned to basic training in San Diego. None of his instructors questioned his age. None of his fellow recruits suspected anything. Within weeks, Calvin received his orders. He was being sent to the Pacific Fleet. His ship would be the USS South Dakota, one of the most powerful battleships in the American Navy. The 12-year-old was going to war. The USS South Dakota was a monster of a ship. Over 600 feet long, bristling with massive 16-inch guns, carrying a crew of nearly 2,000 men. To Calvin, it was the most impressive thing he had ever seen. He was assigned to an anti-aircraft gun crew. His job was to help load ammunition and assist the gunners during combat. It was dangerous work. Anti-aircraft crews were exposed to enemy fire. They had no armor protection. When Japanese planes attacked, they would be standing in the open. Calvin threw himself into training. He learned every aspect of his station. He memorized the loading procedures. He practiced until his movements were automatic. The older sailors noticed his dedication, but none suspected his true age. The South Dakota joined the Pacific Fleet and began operating in the waters around the Solomon Islands. The Japanese were fighting desperately to hold Guadalcanal. Both sides were throwing everything they had into the battle. On the night of November 14, 1942, American intelligence detected a Japanese bombardment force heading toward Henderson Field. The enemy fleet included the battleship Kirishima, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission was to destroy the American airfield. The South Dakota was ordered to intercept. Along with the battleship USS Washington and 4 destroyers, they would meet the Japanese force in the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Calvin checked his equipment one final time. He had no idea what was coming. He had never experienced combat. He did not know that this night would become one of the most savage naval engagements of the entire Pacific War. At 11 o'clock p.m., radar detected the enemy fleet. Battle stations were called. Calvin ran to his gun position. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal was about to begin. The battle erupted in chaos. Japanese searchlights suddenly illuminated the American destroyers. Within seconds, the enemy opened fire. American ships began taking hits immediately. The South Dakota pushed forward into the combat zone. Then disaster struck. An electrical failure knocked out power across the entire ship. Radar went dark. Fire control systems went offline. The battleship was temporarily blind. Japanese cruisers spotted the crippled vessel. They concentrated their fire on the South Dakota. Shell after shell slammed into the battleship. In just 7 minutes, the ship was hit 47 times. Calvin was at his gun station when the explosion started. He saw men around him cut down by shrapnel. He felt the deck shake with each impact. Fires were breaking out everywhere. The smoke was so thick he could barely see. Then a shell exploded near his position. The blast sent metal fragments slicing through the air. Calvin felt something hit his face. The impact knocked him off his feet. He tumbled down through an opening in the deck, falling 3 full levels before crashing onto a lower platform. He lay there in the darkness, blood streaming from his jaw. His arms were burned. Pain shot through his entire body. For a moment, he could not move. But above him, Calvin could hear the sounds of the battle still raging. He could hear wounded men calling for help. Something inside him refused to quit. Slowly, painfully, Calvin pulled himself up. He could not return to his gun station. His injuries were too severe, but he could still help the wounded. For the next several hours, Calvin dragged himself through the damaged sections of the ship. He found injured sailors and helped pull them to safety. He applied bandages with burned hands. He carried men who could not walk. The 12-year-old boy worked through the night, ignoring his own wounds, refusing medical attention until he had done everything he could for his shipmates. When dawn finally came, the Japanese fleet had withdrawn. The South Dakota had survived, but 47 men were gone, and many more were wounded. Calvin collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. He had earned the respect of every man who witnessed his actions that night. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal was a decisive American victory. The Japanese battleship Kirishima was sunk by the USS Washington. The enemy fleet retreated. Henderson Field was saved. The tide of the Pacific War had begun to turn. Calvin Graham was recommended for the Bronze Star for his actions during the battle. He was also awarded the Purple Heart for his wounds. At 12 years old, he had proven himself in combat against one of the most powerful navies on Earth. But Calvin's secret could not last forever. After the battle, the South Dakota returned to port for repairs. Calvin's mother had been searching for her son ever since he disappeared. When she finally tracked him down, she contacted the Navy and revealed the truth. Her son was 12 years old. He had forged her signature. He had lied about his age. Everything on his enlistment papers was fraudulent. The Navy was furious. They had allowed a child to serve in combat. They had put a boy on the front lines of a major naval engagement. The scandal had to be contained. Calvin was immediately arrested. He was stripped of his medals. The Bronze Star and Purple Heart that he had earned with his own blood were taken away. He was thrown into the brig at Corpus Christi, Texas. For 3 months, a 12-year-old war veteran sat in a military prison. His crime was wanting to serve his country. His punishment was disgrace. When Calvin was finally released, he was given a dishonorable discharge. The Navy wanted to pretend he had never existed. Calvin Graham spent the next 50 years fighting a different kind of battle. He was determined to restore his military record and reclaim the honors he had earned. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter finally granted Calvin an honorable discharge. His military record was officially corrected, but his medals were still not returned. Calvin continued fighting. He wrote letters. He contacted politicians. He refused to let the Navy forget what he had done. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation that restored Calvin's Bronze Star. But the Purple Heart remained withheld. Calvin passed away in 1992 at the age of 62, still waiting for full recognition. He never saw his Purple Heart returned. 2 years after his passing, the Secretary of the Navy finally restored Calvin Graham's Purple Heart. The youngest sailor ever to serve in combat for the United States Navy was finally given the honor he had earned 50 years earlier. Today, Calvin Graham's story is remembered as one of the most remarkable tales of courage and determination in American military history. A 12-year-old boy who wanted to serve his country so badly that he broke the law to do it. A child who fought like a man and suffered like a hero. His sacrifice proved that courage has no minimum age, and his fight for recognition proved that justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever.